When you look at the kind of games Capcom were releasing into arcades during the late 1980s through to the mid-90s, Pang feels like a slightly unusual addition to their lineup. Where the company were known during that period for their fantastically produced action games, including a ton of memorable brawlers and landmark titles like Street Fighter II, they weren't really known for simpler single-screen games. What accounts for this shift in tone is that the game wasn't actually developed by Capcom themselves. It was made by Mitchell Corporation in Japan, with Capcom handling distribution in Western territories. And although it might have seemed at odds with the more visceral nature of the company's wares at the time, it was a smart acquisition on their part. Its accessible, addictive gameplay, which supported 1 or 2 players, made it the kind of thing that would suck down spare change at a rate of knots, and its simple pick-up-and-play nature made it a prime candidate for conversion to home systems. Coincidentally, 1989, the year of the Pang coin-op's release into arcades, was also the year Nintendo's Game Boy shipped to retail. By virtue of the game's design, it was a perfect fit for the soon-to-be massively popular handheld, and so, a few years later, in 1993, a portable monochrome version inevitably appeared. Although, interestingly, this version was handled by neither Capcom nor Mitchell Corporation, instead being farmed out to the renowned Hudson Soft. Pang is one of those games that starts simply, but wastes no time in throwing new ideas at you. Controlling your intrepid, pith-helmeted hero at the bottom of the screen, your job is to pop the bouncing bubbles in each of its internationally themed stages, which sounds easy enough, except to say that you're playing against a time limit and these bubbles are obviously toxic, or something. Either that or your in-game character is a massive wimp, because should you collide with one of them, you'll bounce off the screen and lose a life. From the outset, you're armed with a harpoon that fires toward the top of the screen, trailing a wire that pops those troublesome bubbles on contact. However, there's a bit of Asteroids influence going on here, so it's not necessarily enough to pop a bubble once. If it's a large one, it'll split into smaller, equally deadly bubbles that have to be popped in turn. It's trickier than it looks though, because these bubbles are moving all the time, meaning you have to as well, knowing when to stand your ground and shoot, and when to run away like the trypophobic wuss you evidently are. As you play through the different stages, the gameplay rapidly becomes more complex. Hostile critters show up, and the stages start to introduce things like ladders, split-level design, and destructible barriers. But not everything is stacked against you. There are power-ups to aid you in a variety of different ways, including multiple harpoons, sticky harpoons that stay on screen for longer after you shoot them, a Vulcan cannon, which basically replaces your harpoon with a shotgun, and other items that freeze bubbles in the air or explode them into their smallest parts. This is the kind of game that might not look terribly engrossing at first glance, but it's surprisingly addictive once you start playing, and it's got that easy to play, difficult to master quality about it. The dodge and shoot gameplay, cleverly evolving stage designs, and all those different pickups are enough to keep you on your toes and ensure the game doesn't get boring. And being one of those fixed screen arcade games that I love so much, I think it makes the jump to the Game Boy's monochrome screen quite comfortably. But Pang isn't perfect. This conversion is saddled with a few minor but irritating problems, and they're just enough to make me feel a bit less enthusiastic about it than I do other ports of it that I've played on other systems. The least of its problems is that there's no 2-player mode. I'm not going to hold that against the game because, honestly, setting up 2-player games on the Game Boy is a bit of a hassle. But seeing as it's one of those games that honestly is fun to play with a friend, and other ports manage to include that particular feature, it's a shame that it's absent from this one. There's some noticeable slowdown when the screen gets busy as well, which isn't something you'll necessarily see very often, especially if you get good at clearing stages of bubbles quickly. But it's annoying when it happens, sometimes slowing the pace of play to a crawl. The game's biggest problem though is that its controls are a bit finicky. The general business of moving from side to side and firing your harpoons is fine, but when you get to later stages where ladders and platforms start to appear, navigating them feels more difficult than it has any business to. I found it was too easy to get stuck on them, and that's a problem in a game where you're surrounded by constantly moving objects that are all out to kill you. This is already a game that calls for good hand-to-eye coordination and a measure of dexterity, so when you lose a life because you are fighting against clumsy controls, it's quite frustrating. I also found a few instances of rather sloppy game design. For example, in one stage where bubbles are walled off behind destructible blocks, I found that if I picked up the Vulcan power-up before turning them loose, or got stuck with it after bursting the other bubbles in that stage, I was trapped there until my time ran out. The problem here is that you can't shoot blocks with the Vulcan. You have to use a regular harpoon. I feel like that's the kind of situation that, if you're unlucky enough to find yourself in, a game should gently help you out of. It's really a shame that the Game Boy version of Pang is afflicted by these issues, because it's an otherwise decent port of a really fun game, and they do let it down. Considering the obvious limitations of the Game Boy, it was occasionally graced with arcade ports that felt nothing short of miraculous. Off the top of my head, I remember the likes of R-Type, Gradius and Double Dragon all being surprisingly good, and they were certainly well received, enjoying critical acclaim on their release. Pang, in my honest opinion, doesn't really warrant the same kind of praise, because where those other games work excellently as downsized, retooled versions of their arcade namesakes, I don't think this one is quite as accomplished when you view it in that light. Maybe it's just me, but it feels like the kind of thing that should be easier to translate, and that makes problems like its fiddly platforming stand out and feel more problematic. It's still a very impressive port though, and feels very much at home on Nintendo's 8-bit handheld, retaining a great deal of the original game's likeable character, as well as the core gameplay that reliably makes it fun to kill time with whatever system it appears on. So if you're in the market for a version of Pang, I wouldn't say you should make any special effort to pick this one up over one of the better known console or computer versions, but if you're specifically looking for a handheld port or feel a particular need to bust some bubbles on the Game Boy, it's certainly good enough to be getting along with.